We are live now for a special session with Mr. Sushant. He's a cyber law expert and techno-legal consultant, and he also provides solutions on various issues from cybersecurity to the and blockchain. We have an interesting session for the Indian Journal of AI and Law on this session. I'll introduce myself a little. This is Abhivardhan. So today I will just asking the question as why AI regulation is needed to enforce in Indian law. This is a very question. Do not to discuss this aspect in the so sir I will ask you and meanwhile as I would go I would ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you. A very good evening to all. And then I once again think that Indian Society of Artificial Intelligence and Law, and specifically Abhivardhan, has come up with this very distinct topic of why AI regularization is near to impossible or very hard in Indian law. I think you're miles ahead in your thought leadership when nobody today is talking about this kind of a scenario. And with AI being the new flavor of the moment, I think it's very, very commendable that this kind of a session is scheduled in the light of bringing to some discussion the legalities, the legal challenges brought forth by artificial intelligence, and the kind of what do you say impossibilities and the kinds of technical and legal issues are going to be very, very different altogether compared to any other form of technology. I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion as we go forward. Next slide, please. Um, I'm of the opinion that we require a distinctive artificial intelligence law. Why? Because the present law that's in, it's not been defined, keeping in view the kind of challenges brought forth by artificial intelligence. I think that being so, it's going to be a very, very interesting kind of a scenario because the existing laws were never kept in mind. The artificial intelligence and the like is going to develop at such a rapid pace. And not just that, I think there are lots of cutting edge legal regulatory policy issues that AI brings forward and that needs to be specifically addressed in the domain of artificial intelligence legalities. Not just that, I believe personally that a lot of policy framework needs to happen in this domain. And I really appreciate the Indian Society of Artificial Intelligence and Law because they've come up with this distinctive concept of doing research and making up a consultation paper on this area. I think that sounds to be the need of the hour, keeping in view the kind of manner in which AI is getting penetrated into the present market. Next slide, please. This is the usual response I evoke whenever I take a session. So since I'm not able to see most of the viewers who are watching this webinar or interview, I think I'm sure that this will be the kind of expression. More specifically, when you know that there is no distinctive or specific legislation relating to artificial intelligence, and whatever that we are talking today is just presumption and assumptions on the various kinds of issues that are likely to emerge in the legal jurisprudence of artificial intelligence. It's going to be presenting an interesting discussion as we go forward. Next slide, please. Well, I thought of just collating some of these latest developments and then bringing forward certain new aspects. According to this particular news, when we look at it, AI is going to permeate from cyberspace to outer space. I think this is a very, very interesting scenario because all along, most of us thought that AI is going to just confine itself to cyberspace because it's going to be ultimately nothing but the information and technology in the electronic or digital format. But with this kind of a scenario which is brought forward by Pentagon, I think a lot of work needs to happen, even considering the outer space activities. When I look at this, I am reminded of China's national cyber security law, which has been made in a very distinctive manner. Why? Because normally any kinds of cyber security activities that are happening across cyberspace are only limited to cyberspace and the like. But however, when you look at the national cyber security law of China, it's very distinct, since they've made it applicable not just to cyberspace but to outer space, seabeds, as also polar territories and the like. So I think that being the message, it's going to be a very interesting journey that AI is going to pose in terms of its applicability, and then specific legal nuances with regard to outer space and in the context of AI need to formulate as things pass by. Next slide, please. This is the negative, shall I say, side of AI. And AI today is used by a lot of cyber criminals to launch various kinds of cyber attacks. I think specifically AI and cyber crimes would be the new toast of the times. That's currently happening, and there are lots of organizations across the darknet which are trying to come up with cybercrime as a service by using artificial intelligence. I think we'll have more discussion on these areas as we proceed further. But just to bring in that kind of a focus that it is also trying to bring in some dark legal challenges, I thought of just including this slide. Next slide, please. Um, I think our IT Minister, Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad, has recently inaugurated India's National Artificial Intelligence Portal. And it's so interesting that the government of the country has recognized and paved way for the artificial intelligence, since it's going to be the new flavor of the times, and then it's going to be seeing a lot of development and usage, especially during this time of pandemic, as well as the other areas as we go forward. So it's very interesting that we have a dedicated a national AI portal being launched. It's going to be very interesting to see how the governments of the world are trying to use artificial intelligence for various kinds of operations. Next slide, please. Now, before I start giving up my analysis on the various kinds of legal challenges that artificial intelligence brings in, I just want to tell you two things. First thing is, I don't wish to put in a negative area here, because the main objective of my presentation is just to bring about some kinds of cutting legal issues that are arising across artificial intelligence. And I just thought of bringing in some of my views and viewpoints, because it's going to be entirely a different landscape altogether. And today, at this point when I'm talking to you, there is no dedicated artificial intelligence law in the country. And not just that, a lot of countries are actually in the voyage of coming up with distinctive artificial intelligence legislations. I think all of us are in that state of voyage where we are undergoing the completely different paradigm as we go forward. So this is the whole agenda behind my interview and the presentation today. And I'll be happy to answer any kinds of questions relating to artificial intelligence and law, because it's going to be a very good learning experience. And more so, as a cyber law student, I would like to see and ensure that the jurisprudence in the light of artificial intelligence is going to be built in such a way that it's going to bring in a lot of cyber, legal, ethical, policy, regulatory issues with the advent of AI. And then it will be more interesting to see and hear from various stakeholders on the areas of their viewpoints, in order to ensure that the cyber legal jurisprudence relating to artificial intelligence is built in a proper and legal manner, covering a broad ambit of areas. So this is the whole kind of message that I thought of sharing with you before I get forward. Now, before giving any kinds of legal challenges to any particular field of artificial intelligence, I would like to just start off with something that's going to be increasingly the primary point of discussion that we all need to be really aware of. Why? Because unless there is some kind of discussion that is happening on this primary aspect, going forward would not be actually viable, because this is one interesting primary area that needs to be addressed. I feel and that brings in a lot of different kinds of clarity on how artificial intelligence is going to actually come with regard to the kind of legal status. What kind of legal status that artificial intelligence would have to be looked into is going to be an interesting question as we go forward. um, I just would like to express my viewpoint that, see, when we're trying to come up with legal status, that means we're trying to quantify and give legal status to artificial intelligence. It becomes very interesting that we have to look at so many different aspects. Can I treat an AI entity as a company, or can I treat that as a legal person? Can I treat that as an organization? Can I treat that as a agent, or can I treat that as a limited partnership entity? That's going to be very, very interesting. But end of the day, what I wish to tell you is that the message is loud and clear. Unless there is some kind of limited legal recognition and legal what do you say recognition or legal status which is accorded to artificial intelligence, I think without doing this, going forward is going to be exposing us to a lot of different kinds of legalities, and more specifically, the basic fundamental aspect would have to be addressed before we go forward. So I believe that this is the first and foremost important aspect that we need to bring in the light of AI as a legal entity. Well, that poses a lot of questions because we've been seeing that a lot of different kinds of takes have been taken up by different countries in terms of recognizing artificial intelligence as a separate legal entity. We've seen that in the Western countries, and more specifically in the Middle East, that robo was actually tried to be given a legal status, and then if I'm not wrong, I think the name of that was Sophia, if I'm not mistaken. And then one of the Middle East countries came up with some kind of legal recognition of providing some kind of status to this particular robo. It's not just that, there have been a lot of entities across the country. When you look at China, I found that artificial intelligence is now being used even in the news and media agency. I think a lot of work started to emerge in China, which is trying to demonstrate some kinds of thought leadership in terms of coming up with AI legislation. I think these are just early times, but it's going to be posing a very, very interesting challenge, not just from a legal perspective, but also from a company legal perspective. So I think the company law also would have to be putting in some kinds of change, what do you say, thought process here, because when you provide legal recognition and legal status to artificial intelligence in the light of treating it either as an entity or as an agent or as a what do you say partnership entity, it's going to be the company law that also should throw some kinds of light in terms of interpreting AI as a legal entity. I think this is one more area that I thought of focusing here. And before I go forward, I'm open to any questions relating to this particular aspect of legal status to artificial intelligence.
Great. So my question is that we understand that artificial intelligence may not be considered an equitable entity like a company or a trust or maybe other kind of legal entity. Mostly what happens is that we have juristic personalities, which simply means that we have rivers which are recognized as juristic persons. We have copyright forms which are somewhere down the line considered. Then more examples can be given. Sometimes, so one curious case was Sophia, which actually was that this product from Hanson Robotics became a citizen. And the question generally which is being kept in this regard is that Sophia cannot be an ideal person in the sense of understanding how legal personality works. So since we know that thought leadership is an aspect in China which is a different thing to start with, what kind of legal entity, at least via sense of agency or maybe some severability, uh, can we have with regards AI? What do you think, sir?
I think, see, the point that you have raised is a very valid point that we are talking of here. And then given the way that we cannot consider what do you say artificial intelligence as a juristic personality. But however, it will be interesting that we'll have to keep in mind what kinds of legal recognition has to be given specifically with regard to artificial intelligence, because I'd like to put in my view that ultimately it's going to be hard to perceive the kind of legal order, because artificial intelligence first of all brings in a lot of different kinds of legalities. Now let's say that we treat that as a legal entity, or we give some kinds of clarity on that. But however, there are going to be a lot many questions that are going to arise, because when you consider artificial intelligence as an entity, what kinds of liabilities would be affixed on it, what could be the potential ramifications, and how could it be a separate kind of a legal entity is going to be a very very distinctive scenario, especially when we look at some definitions that have been put up. See, let's say that we have various definitions of a legal entity, that it's an association or a corporation or a partnership or a proprietorship that has the capacity to enter into agreements and things like that. But on the other side, when you look at it as a non-human entity, legal person, when you look at the definition of legal person, it obviously says that it's a non-human entity that is treated for a limited legal purpose. Whether it's a corporation, it's something like which can be sued and which can sue. So I think in that context, I feel that maybe artificial intelligence could be treated as a legal person, since it's a non-human entity that is only created for a limited legal purpose. So when we look at the usage specifically in this context, we have a very limited purpose, and we're also seeing a lot of distinctive uses that artificial intelligence is posing. For example, it's being used in contracts, so wherein it's kind of a mechanism where AI is used for entering into contracts, is also raising the point that it has the capability to enter into the contract. So that is one area that I feel, according to my personal opinion, I feel looking at the definition of a legal person, I think we could probably try to fit in AI into this ambit of a legal person. But however, there could be a lot of challenges, like because when you talk about the constitutional rights and the freedom of speech and the things like that, it's going to be very very ticklish that artificial intelligence, in case it's treated as a legal entity, it's going to bring in a lot of distinctive considerations that lawmakers need to look into. So that's my personal opinion as far as this is concerned.
Okay, one more question on this. So, yes, constitutional issues will always arise because constitutionalism is a big Pandora box for various countries. It may or may not be a kind of eureka or maybe sometimes a solution for them. So, in terms of algorithmic diplomacy, because that is now which is beyond big data, which is now affecting people. How much algorithm centric diplomacy is possible to be seen among states in legalizing and instrumentalizing AI in transborder issues? What do you think, sir?
See, more specifically, that one primary aspect that I would like to put forth here is that, see, since by and large artificial intelligence runs on this code, so I think some kinds of what do you say, surveillance, some kinds of liability, some kinds of attribution has to be made even by the code makers. And then it's ultimately because it's going to be based running on codes. I think that kind of a scenario also would have to be looked into while deciding the instrumentality, and while going forward with regard to the kind of what do you say things that lawmakers need to look into. I think that is one more area that I feel that requires a lot of considerations, because merely writing a code and just saying that washing away your hands, I think that won't not be the right and appropriate manner, because as a writer of a code, you would have to assume certain kinds of significant liability, because ultimately it's you who has created the code, and without that the functioning of AI can move in a completely different paradigm altogether. I think this is one thing that I would like to talk of, specific to your question that you put in.
Great. Thank you so much, sir. Let's move forward and discuss things. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the one more aspect that I thought of just feeding in with regard to AI is there is going to be a lot of bias when you make use of AI. Why? Because AI is nothing but the set of data feeds that you're making in through your code. Ultimately, if your code, if the data set that has been fed into AI is ultimately favorable to any particular entity or any particular thing, I think it's prone to be more biased, and this is going to be more dangerous because we've also started seeing a lot of AI being penetrated in the judiciary, especially the. I mean, I've come across some scenarios while I was researching on it that there have been AI specific courts in China and some other places, because now that artificial intelligence can also go ahead and read and interpret certain things, they've also started working on providing AI in judiciary. Of course, it's not done it to a great level. They have done it in two reasons, in two different scenarios. One is for adjudicating matters of a certain amount, which wherein there is no complexity of issue. So that was one area where they started using AI in deciding judicial interpretations. And the second one was, of course, providing some kinds of assistance to the human judges. And what was more interesting that I found while I was researching was that these kinds of decisions which are rendered by these AI courts are, of course, going to be subject to appeal. And if you're aggrieved with that decision, you can still make an appeal to a human judge. So that was a very interesting scenario that I thought of sharing here. And in this kind of a scenario where there is going to be bias, I think this is going to prejudicially impact the legal justice and the like, because that being so, a lot of different challenges it's going to bring forward in terms of AI in judiciary. So that is one more area that I thought of just bringing forward, because we are in the discussion of the AI and legal challenges. So I thought this could be also one area that we could actually talk of as we proceed our discussion further. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is what was were the challenges that I was actually trying to put in. If you treat that as an agent, if you treat this as a company, if you treat this as a partnership, there are pluses and minuses here and there, because interpreting these in the existing laws are going to be distinctively challenging, because none of these laws were written at the time when artificial intelligence was actually presumed to take significance. So that being so, I think my opinion is some kinds of limited recognition is definitely required in providing some kinds of recognition to AI as we go forward. Failing which, I think it's going to turn out to be a landmine. I mean, because with the kind of distinctive issues that will happen even at the grassroots level, this is going to be very, very critical aspect that one needs to look into. Next slide, please. Now, one another aspect that I was actually trying to bring in here is that by and large, artificial intelligence is now being used for contract generations. So we've seen earlier that blockchain also is one of the paradigms that has started to be used increasingly for contracts. We've seen smart contracts wherein automatically the code is, I mean, containing all the terms of the agreement, and it's just the code that is executing it and then bringing forward the blockchain related contracts. But in that scenario, it's going to be very interesting, because when artificial intelligence is used to draft out a contract, and there are two artificial entities discussing, negotiating, and putting forth the contract, there are going to be lots of legal challenges. Well, ultimately, what we can probably do in the context of the existing laws is that I would just like to draw a comparison to the AI-based contracts in the present legal scenario. When you look at it, ultimately, AI-based contracts are nothing but information and data in the electronic form. That being so, it's very clear that these are nothing but electronic records as far as our Information Technology Act is concerned. And more specifically, when you look at Section 10A of the Information Technology Act, which says that no contract should be denied legal enforceability solely because it's in electronic form. So that being so, I think one can clearly understand that artificial intelligence contracts also could be nothing but end of the day electronic contracts, and they could actually be legally recognized and given validity under the section. But however, they bring in a lot of different challenges altogether, because at the time when we're discussing today, these kinds of e-contracts would require, as of digital and electronic signatures, and whether the artificial intelligence entity who's actually trying to enter into these kinds of contracts, who's what kind of digital signature or electronic signatures would be given to AI related entity is actually one of the greatest, shall I say, issues that the present law doesn't address. Because when you look at Information Technology Act, we are clear that electronic and or the digital signature is only given to entities or individuals. So what happens in case AI entities make use of this contract using digital signature or electronic signature? That is one more area that requires to be specifically addressed, and more specifically in the light of AI based contracts. So apart from this, there are also some distinctive challenges relating to the enforcement of contract, like the frustration of contract, or whether it be the kind of what do you say, consent, whether it's a free consent or not. These are going to pose a lot of different kinds of challenges, which the present Contract Act or the Information Technology Act have not yet been formulated in that direction. I would say that these are just initial discussions. While AI and contracts is going to seem a lot of significant importance, with AI being used by a lot of applications in various manners. So this is one more area that I thought of coming up with, and then putting forward these kinds of discussion, so that some kinds of specific discussions can happen to promote AI related contractual jurisprudence. So that's one more area that I thought of discussing. So this is one more area that requires some distinct legislation. So I'm open to questions relating to AI and contracts.
Sure. Now, the concept of smart contracts actually has been at least considered through some rules, and maybe in near time, a confluence of AI and blockchain is possible because blockchain endorses federalization of information. So, trust centric, decentralized um, systems can be formed. Whereas artificial intelligence, again, as a second kind of disruptive system, will be involving through automations and augmented analytics. Uh, in the legal scenario, how do you think the confluence of AI and blockchain will will influence the legal backdrop of the Indian contract jurisprudence?
Shall I say that basically, see, artificial intelligence would be used in blockchains intrinsically, because given the kind of advantages that it brings in, and more specifically, when you make use of artificial intelligence in blockchain, and that is to generate a smart contract, I think that's going to be a completely different challenge altogether, because it's the AI algorithm that is going to execute the terms and conditions of the contract, and more specifically that it's going to be non-negotiable, because there's no option to negotiate any kinds of smart contracts. And more specifically, talking about the free consent, which the Indian Contract Act actually provides for as a essential for legally enforceable contract. I think free consent would be a challenging aspect in this area, because there is no option given to me. Either I'll have to agree with the terms or I'll have to disagree with the terms. There is no option to negotiate. So that being one of the greatest challenges, I think that's going to be one of the influencing factors with the Indian Contract Act. Not just that, but there are also some things that I would like to talk of here. Ultimately, all this is nothing but an algorithm, or it's nothing but an automated program that is going to execute the contract. So let's say that some kinds of instructions have been laid down, and there are no lawful objects here. There is no lawful consideration here. There is no lawful subject matter here, and then it's purely relating to something that is prohibited by law. If that kind of a contract also is possible through these kinds of intersection of AI and blockchain into smart contracts, because it's ultimately the human mind that's actually putting up the coding for required for the execution of the smart contract. And if not, at least let's say that if an AI system automatically picks up something that is not legal and interprets that to be the exact intention of the parties, and puts in an algorithm accordingly, and then that is being embedded on blockchain, and that is being generated as a smart contract, that is going to bring in a lot of distinctive legal and policy regulatory issues in the light of contract law as well. So I believe that this is going to be the kind of manner in which the contract law also would be influenced, because unless it meets the essentials of a enforceable contract, it cannot be seen as a valid contract in the eyes of the contract law. So this is also going to bring in a distinctive amount of legal challenges, especially when you're talking about these smart contracts. It's not just that, but I would just want to tell you one thing. Even regarding smart contracts, despite the fact that legal recognition is given under Section 10A, you can argue everything is fine. But the very fact that the smart contracts pose one negative, or shall I say gray area, is when you talk about the way in which they are authenticated. Ultimately, there is no authority here. So there is only there's no trusted authority anywhere in the blockchain, because it's going to remove the concept of trusted authority. Ultimately, the authentication of a smart contract in blockchain is done through hash, which is generated by people in the blockchain. So ultimately, that whether that particular hash or digital signature, is it obtained from a certifying authority or not, is going to be an interesting scenario as far as the enforceability of smart contracts are concerned. So Section 35 of the IT Act also would bring in a lot of legal considerations here, because the moment it is not making use of digital signatures or electronic signatures issued by a certifying authority, such contract would be actually considered to be invalid, and it will not be considered valid as far as our present laws are concerned. That being so, the same would apply even to AI based contracts. So if the kind of authentication is done, since AI is integrated with blockchain for in generating smart contracts, this would also be one more area that lawmakers need to intrinsically look into. Next slide, please. So now privacy is going to be completely a different paradigm altogether. But more so with the recent judgment of the Supreme Court that privacy is a fundamental right. That being so, it's going to bring in a lot of different privacy related challenges. Why? Because ultimately, artificial intelligence would also comprise of the data that is being fed, and then it runs on data sets. And when you feed in that data sets, there are going to be two kinds of privacy issues that I can primarily see. One is there could be an invasion of personal privacy, as also there could be a invasion of data privacy. Why? Because data or information in the electronic form is fed ideally into the artificial intelligence system. AI system would basically be comprising of data or information in the electronic form. So therefore, when you try to compare and try to bring forward this kinds of personal privacy and data privacy in the context of the present legislations, I think it's going to be a very different paradigm altogether. Why? Personal privacy. When we talk of personal privacy, yes, we do not have at this moment when we are having this discussion, there is no dedicated privacy related legislation in India currently. But however, shall I say that Information Technology Act has brought forward certain concepts relating to data privacy as well as also personal privacy. So when you make use of data sets, it's going to be increasingly important that the AI systems do not themselves cause any kinds of privacy issues to personal and data. Why? Because a lot of information has been fed in, and this information could be sensitive information, could be personal information, and it's very important that the AI system protects the what do you say, privacy of individuals, as also the specific sensitive and personal data. So that's going to bring in a lot of unique challenges as we go forward, because wherein we often become pawns in the hands of this AI system when AI systems start processing data. Why? Because there's no human control of. So I think AI data protection would also have to assume greater significance with the artificial intelligence becoming the new jewel in the crown. I think that this is one more area that I thought of focusing, and just not that, but this could actually this should actually not affect in any manner the kinds of personal privacy as well as the kind of data privacy of any corporates. So more specifically, I would like to just talk of one scenario here. Now that artificial intelligence is not just used by individuals, but a lot of entities are making use of artificial intelligence for doing a variety of activities, whether it's for enhancing their customer experience, or whether it's for promoting their products, or whether it's for improving their sales and things like that. This is going to bring in a lot of personal privacy issues, and also corporate data issues in terms of that. So I think that is also one area that needs to be intrinsically looked at, because ultimately it's nothing but artificial intelligence is nothing but the data set and the information, the data set and information in the electronic or digital format. I think this is also one area. Not just that, if suppose, let's say that inadvertently some kinds of personal or sensitive data is actually disclosed by AI, which it's not supposed to do, then what happens to the kind of privacy breach is also an interesting scenario that we should really consider. So that being so, I think the privacy laws also need to be amended to ensure that these kinds of distinctive privacy issues posed in by AI are adequately covered. So this is something that I thought of sharing. I'm open to questions with regard to AI and privacy.
Sure, sir. So my question is that a new concept of differential privacy has come, in which certain noise, which means something which is a vague kind of information, is added into the queried information, so that the real identity and the real identifiable characteristics of the information which are requested by a querier is somewhere down the line protected, but often which is employed by machine learning. However, there's also a scenario that the same is actually being done to manipulate the machine learning devices so as to impact privacy. So, is the legal approach towards privacy just an absolute approach beyond the question whether privacy is an absolute right or not? But as the Potosami judgment says, it is. But since the privacy is an absolute right, then in approach, how privacy in India in a social and anthropological context to be made better to uphold rule of law?
I think a harmonized approach needs to be adopted in this kind of a scenario, because it's very important that you actually try to protect privacy, because that now that being the fundamental right, it's definitely going to be the need of the hour. But however, I feel that privacy should not be an impediment for growth of AI, because that's going to really hamper the kind of penetration of AI into various aspects. I think an approach which is balancing both the privacy aspect as well as something that can be used to bring in some kinds of balance between the privacy and also the application of AI in different fields has to be traditionally looked into by the lawmakers today while they're coming up with answering of these distinctive challenges posed in by privacy. Because more specifically, there are also different kinds of data. See, we also have something called non-personal data, which are completely anonymous. But however, thanks to the latest developments that are happening up, these anonymous data also could be in a sense used to identify the particular individual. So that being so, it all depends ultimately on the kinds of data that has been fed into the AI system and the kinds of processing that the AI system does with respect to this data. I think that is also one great area that needs to be focused in order to ensure that the protection of personal and data privacy on one hand, as well as encouraging and promoting the future growth of AI on the other hand, has to be the vehicle of the computational progress that has to go forward.
Sure. One more question I have. So, when we categorize regions in India based on urban, semi-urban, and urban rural areas, the urban places in India, mostly metropolitan cities, may be able to uphold some kind of restrictive privacy considerations, and maybe they can harmonize it with innovative AI, where pseudonymization of information itself can be appropriately regulated. In semi-urban regions, it might be another question. It may take a little time, but for a rural region, okay, it's true that in AI will not be in a larger sense of perspective. Nevertheless, how would it change our perspectives towards the anthropological side of privacy? Because mostly balancing can only be done when the absoluteness of privacy as a right can be appropriately expanded and not elasticized, which mostly happens because there's a dichotomy which is being created that the legal fraternity, not all, but some of the legal fraternity may does fail in understanding the technical issues that disruptive technologies do bring. So, how do you see in the semi-urban and rural regions in India, and how a sense of legitimacy and rule of law in case of maintaining privacy can be maintained? What do you think?
That's a very interesting question that you have brought forward. So I would say that yeah, it's going to be a different kind of a paradigm altogether with the rural sector being using these kinds of technologies. I think most important aspect that I would look at is that, see, it should be in a manner where even the interpretation of privacy as a fundamental right is not absolute. Why? Because when you look at some aspects, see, the very fact that the fundamental rights itself provided by the constitution are not absolute, they're subject to reasonable restrictions. I think in the same manner, privacy is also not absolute right, and then it could be subject to a certain kinds of restrictions that go forward. But when you look at the new draft that has come up with regard to the personal data protection bill, I think that brings in certain kinds of what do you say issues that the governments and the other agencies are exempt from doing any kinds of data protection mechanisms, and then they can take the personal data of the citizens at any time, even without proper kinds of consent. I don't wish to criticize that, but I only wish to tell you that, see, that is the kind of interpretation which the present draft bill that has been referred to the Joint Parliamentary Committee is actually now come up with. I think we have just rehashed the complete GDPR and then not even applied it in the practical scenario. And then we are trying to come up with some distinctive framework in regard to data protection. When you talk about this in terms of rural areas, I think it's going to be very, very challenging. Not just that, I think some basic awareness relating to data privacy, data protection would have to be made even applicable to rural areas, because there is a lot. I think a lot of capacity building needs to happen in this domain, because it's just like that. Whether you drive a vehicle in a rural area or whether you drive a vehicle in the urban area, ultimately the traffic rules are going to be one and the same. It's just the kind of mindset and the education that has been that has to be the primary area that I feel. Because when you're making use of AI as a disruptive technology in the rural areas, I think increasingly some kinds of focus on the legalities relating to data privacy, data protection would also have to be instilled at a grassroots level, so as to ensure that they're equipped with what's right and what's wrong, so that they don't move on the wrong side of the law. That's what I personally feel. That's the way I think we can try to address some things, if not completely, the aspect of privacy in terms of rural areas.
Great. One last question, then we'll move for the
Sure.
next aspect of it. So, one proposition which could be made in this regard is that privacy itself cannot be considered as an antithetical idea, because often the idea of social contract itself endorses people to have a system of accountability and transparency. So, is it possible that while maintaining accountability and transparency, privacy as an absolute right under Article 21 of the Constitution of India can be shifted from the dichotomy model to where it is considered antithetical to notions of sovereignty and collective interests, to a more rational approach where collective and individual interests are uh, 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 directed towards a more congruent wave of accountability first, and then shifted towards the idea of liability in a gradual way, so that experiential benefits are also given uh, in order to benefit the due process of determining whether privacy has been uh, afforded or violated or influenced or not. What do you think, sir?
So I think clearly going forward, I think when we are trying to deal with any kinds of personal or sensitive information, I think the most important aspect that one needs to look into is what kinds of potential precautions are available in the artificial intelligence system, so as to ensure that they protect the personal privacy. This has to be looked into. Not just that, I think the user of any AI related services would also have to understand how such AI solutions would be protecting and using their data. And apart from that, what kinds of due diligence mechanisms have been done by the AI systems in terms of ensuring that adequate safeguards are given to the to protect the privacy, also would be assuming greater significance. Why? Because primarily that I would say that unless you have these kinds of parameters, it's very difficult to evaluate whether there's a privacy breach or not. And not just that, in the present scenario that we are into, 100% privacy is only going to be a myth. So we are living in a way, good, bad, or worst, that we'll have to understand that there are going to be cyber security breaches, there are going to be privacy breaches all around. And with internet baking geography as a history, I think it's going to be a completely different paradigm. But what one has to really understand is how practical is the kind of aspect of protecting privacy in terms of AI, and what are the common parameters, or shall I say denominators, that AI systems need to adopt, keeping in view the kind of balance between the user and the AI system with regard to privacy. I think this is one kinds of suggestion I would like to pitch in here.
Great. Let's move forward and discuss things further. Yeah.
Okay. Now, like I said, one more aspect that I would like to talk of here is that, see, there is also a possibility that automatic decisions and intelligent decisions have been done by the AI-based devices. In this kind of a scenario, it's going to be very interesting, because any decision making that has been made by an AI system would be depending on the kind of data being fed into that machines. And there is a possibility of manipulating that data. There is a possibility of even disclosing some data, which is going to be one of the very key essential privacy issue, as well as I am concerned. So that also needs to be specifically looked into while you're coming up with data privacy relating to AI. So this is also going to bring in a lot of distinct amount of legal challenges as we go forward. Next slide, please. Now, AI and data protection are also going to assume a greater significance, because more so that in the light of a lot of countries now coming up with their own data protection laws, it's going to be completely a different paradigm altogether. And more so in a present situation where I think GDPR is the new star of the avenue, because every look at most of the countries' data protection laws. I think all of them are trying to rehash GDPR to their local flavor, and then trying to make that as a model law. So that being so, I think that's also going to be essentially an important aspect that AI lawmakers need to be specifically looking into while they're coming up with data protection guidelines for AI entities. I mean, the slide is not changed. Could you just change the next slide, please? Yeah, yeah. So apart from this, there's also going to be the question of data retention, and then a common denominators and standards of data protection would have to be outlined. And then because ultimately AI itself is going to populate a lot of data on its own, so there are going to be two kinds of distinctive challenges. One is the kind of data sets being fed into the AI systems. That is one. Second, AI as a technology is also going to populate a lot of big data. So that also is one more aspect. So in both these scenarios, giving adequate data protection parameters or guidelines would actually be required in order to ensure that proper adequate data protection is done with regard to AI, so that there is no breach. And even if there is a breach, at least some kinds of mechanism to notify the breach has to be made mandated, as the other laws of the world have actually now come up with. In this kind of scenario, I would just like to also talk of one more perspective here. I would like to pitch in two ideas here. One idea is analyzing AI with regard to GDPR, and the other one is analyzing AI with regard to the present Indian cyber law. So these are the two things that I would like to focus on. Now let's go forward in talking about AI in GDPR. So when you talk about AI in GDPR, ultimately any AI entity which is actually collecting, processing, storing any of the personal data belonging to the European Union and the like, they will have to be amenable to GDPR, and that brings in a distinctive challenge, because is the AI system a data controller or a data processor? That is going to be a very very different kind of a scenario that we'll have to look into, because normally a data controller is someone who controls and who has some kinds of an authority on what kinds of data needs to be shared in, what data cannot be shared in. So ultimately, he is controller of data. Now, talking about AI as a data controller will be a distinct perspective. Why? Because there is no human intervention here. Whether the automated AI system would be capable enough to act as a data controller is going to be an interesting legal scenario that we need to understand. Not just that, of course, we also typically know that AI is going to definitely be a data processor, because it's going to process the data that has been fed into by the data sets. So it's definitely going to be a data processor. But what becomes important is analyzing whether it's a data controller. So that's also going to bring in a lot of legal discussion among various stakeholders, because all along we have been trying to say that it's going to be entities, or it's going to be the data subjects who are going to whose data has been collected are going to be the data controller. But in this kind of a scenario wherein the data of a data subject is fed into the AI system, and AI system takes an intelligent decision whether such information needs to be shared with any respective entity or not, and if it's the entity that is determining the control, I think this is going to bring in a variety of legal challenges as far as data controller concept is concerned. So this is one more area. And not just that, implementing the kind of data subject rights that GDPR brings in, whether it's right to rectification, whether it's right to erasure, right to be forgotten, or right to retention, I think right to storage are going to be very very distinctly will have to be distinctly addressed as we go forward, because in the context of AI, where everything is automated and it's running through the data sets that has been fed into, this becomes a totally a different ball game altogether. So this is in terms of GDPR. Now talking in terms of Indian cyber legal scenarios, I think ultimately AI systems are nothing but data intermediaries under Section 21W of the Information Technology Act. Why? Because they're ultimately collecting electronic records and are providing some kinds of service with respect to the electronic records thereof. So therefore, that being so, AI entities would have to be compliant to the Indian cyber law, more specifically under Section 43A of the IT Act, read along with the Information Technology Rules 2011. So that is one of the key areas that the present AI entities would have to look into, because the present scenarios obligate that while you're collecting, processing, handling sensitive personal data or information, you would have to exercise due diligence under this particular legislation. So the due diligence would have to be by way of having some kinds of policies, whether it's privacy policies, terms and conditions, use specific data protection, user agreements, and grievance mechanisms. I think these are also the present requirement as far as the due diligence is concerned for the AI entities. No, now that AI entities are actually not either human controlled, and they're only merely based on the data sets that they've been fed into, it becomes very essential that this also has to be looked into by the AI makers, because it's the complete paradigm is going to be totally different. When I look at the legal landscape of compliance under this data protection legal regime, it's very clear that it's not just going to be the AI system, but it's also going to be the coder who's actually trying to put in this code through the AI system, who will have to be apprised of the legal due diligence required under the law. Not just that, who would be liable in case of breach is also going to be an important aspect. I want to talk about that as we talk about the liabilities. But I thought that this is going to be the tipping point. So I just thought of bringing in the liability aspect as well. So these are the two things that I would like to primarily talk of in terms of data protection. While the whole world is trying to now evolve with the new kinds of issues happening around this COVID-19, data protection becomes the new jewel in the crown. And that's all I have with regard to AI and data protection. I'm open to any questions with relating to data protection and AI, please.
Sure. The question is that on data protection, there may be a consideration that in later time, actually, the data retention right might not be limited to data subjects or companies. Maybe because the capabilities of AI and its learning processes, whether MLDL or RL, which is machine learning, deep learning, and reinforcement learning, will see a paradigm shift, maybe in 5 years, because of the fact that, despite being data centric, new processes are emerging on subjective issues and subjective technical problems. So, developers and scientists will get some hold on data retention in a very significant way. And beyond the differential privacy, it will go. So, can it be assumed that due to the data retention principle, some kind of inherent but inertial and non-active, still recognized rights of artificial intelligence can come into being? What do you think, sir?
Um, I think yes. See, with regard to the kind of distinctive nature that AI has in, I think yeah, it's going to bring in a different paradigm altogether. But I think the different data protection laws which are dealing with the protection of information and data of either entities or human beings still today. I think even artificial intelligence operations can ultimately be broken down in the sense that they're making use of these seven raw materials. I would say that any AI system would typically make use of these seven parameters that go on to form the digital ecosystem. So, if, any AI system would basically be using computers, computer systems, computer networks, computer resources, communication devices, as also data or information in the electronic or digital format. I think the very fact that if you break down the AI operations into these aspects, I think definitely that would throw some kinds of light in the development of the data protection, what do you say, jurisprudence surrounding AI. Given the fact that yes, the data retention also needs to be specifically addressed in terms of AI systems. This is going to at least put in some basic minimum standards of parameters that maybe the lawmakers could actually try to look into while they're coming up with this data protection legislation surrounding AI.
Great. So, in terms of data governance, it's also a problem that, or maybe not a problem, but at least a very interesting observation that the influence of human environments, coupled with the way data subjects react to AI in any form possible, whether AI is in a toothbrush, or AI is in the form of a software, or whether AI is applicable in the form of a robot, or maybe in facial recognition systems, the role of environment and accountability networks will be very interesting, because recently the European Commission proposed that life cycle of artificial intelligence is very essential to the current paradigm of issues and solutions. So, what do you think on that, sir?
Yeah, I think definitely. See, the artificial intelligence is going to be the new future that all of us need to quickly understand. But what becomes very, very essential is that yes, the aspect that it's going to be used in a different manner altogether, whether it's for the data governance and the things like that. But I would like to just switch in one aspect here when you talked of data governance. I think an interesting point that I would just like to make here is that, see, ultimately, there is definitely going to be a feed of data sets for AI systems to actually penetrate their working into any system or application. So ultimately, when you're making use of data for governance, I think that's going to be a very, very interesting scenario, because when personal data or sensitive data is actually being fed into the AI systems, the kind of what do you say, the legal challenges that will arise is going to be enormous. Why? Because there could be a compromise of the system in any way, or because, see, ultimately even cyber crimes are also now being targeted using artificial intelligence as a tool. So that being so, it's going to be a different paradigm altogether. And not just that, with the kind of distinct nature that AI has in terms of its nature, that's also going to bring in a different kinds of challenges, and these are going to be influential, definitely. And I would say that they could also be, like told in the beginning itself, that there are going to be some biased issues also that would like to that would probably be assuming a greater significance here, because ultimately it's nothing but the data that has been fed into. If that data itself is biased, I think that's we can see a different paradigm altogether. And then I think the norms of behavior also internationally have not been defined. I think these kinds of discussions would also give rise to some kinds of what do you say, thoughts in the thought leadership to various countries, because like I said, these kinds of discussions are going to be the key factors in determining the landscape of AI legal jurisprudence, I feel. So I think this is also going to be some interesting area. Not sure about the certainty on when this would be a ground reality. But since now that artificial intelligence is a ground reality, I think we'll have to quickly walk the walk, because we'll have to understand that going forward with artificial intelligence is a gold mine, but without adequate legal considerations, it may turn out to be a landmine. So I think this is also one more area specific in terms of data protection, data retention, and data privacy that is requiring a lot of work has to be done in this area, so as to ensure that these three are dealt in a manner where there is a balance, and then we are at least able to a certain extent prevent privacy breaches, and able to uphold privacy to a certain extent. Next slide,
Great.
please.
Yes. Yeah.
Big data is going to be shall I say, the new toast of the times, because as it is in the present environment today, there is nothing today that's not using big data. And more specifically, this big data analytics is shall I say, turning out to be a completely a new paradigm altogether. And then a lot of entities are trying to use big data for a variety of activities. And then with the kinds of advantages that it's trying to bring in, I think AI is also now going to be using big data in a different manner altogether. So, like I'd spoken, there is a different paradigm of AI in big data in AI, because there's going to be two things. Big data sets are going to be fed into the artificial intelligence systems for the purpose of penetrating them for various applications. And not just that, AI systems itself, because of the intrinsic nature that they have, may also likely to populate a large chunk of big data. So I think these two aspects are going to be very critical, and more so if these data in any manner relates to critical information infrastructure. So I think this is going to be holding a very significant aspect that we need to consider. Not just that, but looking at it from a consumer protection perspective, yes, this is also going to be a different kinds of thing that we need to look at. Why? Because at the end of the day, it has to be understood that the big data pertains to, if the big data is pertaining to some kinds of consumer data, then any kinds of issues that are happening around that, I think the application of consumer protection law would also have to be specifically dealt in with regard to addressing these kinds of challenges. It's not just that. I think we are in a data driven economy today where data is the new turmoil, and then all the relevant stakeholders, whether it's the national stakeholders or the international stakeholders, a lot of emphasis has been laid on protecting big data, and specifically in the light of ensuring that specific parameters of compliance have been laid down on these providers and service providers who are making use of big data so as to ensure that data is adequately protected, and there is no inadvertent what do you say leakage of any data, because we're all in the leaking ecosystem today. And more so in the light of this pandemic situation, with everything moving towards digital, I think it's a very grim picture that all of us are able to see. So that's one more area that I thought of just sharing it with you. I think some kinds of developments are being happening, though not at a fast level, but at least some kinds of thought leadership has been laid down on coming up with some parameters which relate to the compliance of big data and AI. I think some work is happening across the world. Not just that, analyzing this kind of a scenario in the present to the present laws, as we discussed, adding something to the discussion that we had done a few minutes back. I think I would like to tell you that ultimately the big data service providers are also intermediaries under the present Information Technology Act, and they would have to exercise their due diligence. They will have to comply with the laws, and failing which they could be sucked in either as a plaintiff or as a defendant in any kinds of data breach that is happening with regard to the specific big data that's been all around. So that's also one interesting scenario that is going to crop up. And not just that, that I would like to tell you that this kinds of big data and AI is also going to populate a lot of intellectual property related issues. I want to focus on that as we go forward, but just to give you a small kind of indication that yes, big data is going to be populating a lot of amount of IP related issues, because the data that is being fed in may contain intellectual property protection, whether it's the copyright or whether it's the trade secret and the like. It's going to be a completely different paradigm. I think the intellectual property law in this domain also need to be revisited so as to ensure that the kinds of challenges being brought in with the intersection of AI and big data would also have to be specifically addressed, so as to ensure that any kinds of issues are dealt in a proper manner. I know that this cannot be 100% done, but at least to an extent that we are able to be reasonably able to protect ourselves. I think that's the whole message that I wish to give through this particular slide. So because 100% protection is a mistaken notion, shall I say, in the present, given the present kind of what do you say, the online ecosystem that we are all into, and more specifically with regard to AI. So this is something that I thought of sharing with regard to the kinds of legal challenges that AI and big data bring in with regard to their applicability towards Indian law. So this is one more area that requires some kinds of work in the consumer protection law, as well as the existing data protection law, as well as the AI law that needs to be specifically dealt with. So I'm open to questions relating to AI and big data, please.
Sure, sir. One thing is that big data is something which is also concerned with the responsibility frameworks, because in India, big data is somewhere down the line very fluid, and it's not very strong, strongly concorded. And that's also due to the fact that big data is not something which is a technology, but it is a phenomena. And the role of big data will now fade, and maybe that will be saturated into other disruptive technologies. So that transition in India will take time, although a very few companies are doing it. But the transition period sometimes from big data to disruptive technologies in a more multilateral manner within India might take some gestation time. So there will be some legal implications on that. What do you think about it?
Yes, definitely. There are going to be, see, given the fact that the technology is moving at a very rapid pace, and given the fact that there are some more technologies that are actually trying to address this in a more efficient manner, I think, yeah, we could probably see some kind of replacement to big data. But however, shall I say that big data now is not just being used by some private players, but there are also some state actors that are trying to make use of, because we have a couple of our clients who are now associated with different state actors, and who are now being trying to provide big data solutions to them as well. So in this kind of a scenario, I think it's very, very important that the kind of legal nuances which big data and AI, the intersection of both of these bring in, will have to be distinctively addressed, because now that once it's in the state, once it's made part of the state actors, I think there's going to be a lot of critical information infrastructure that's going to be fed into the AI systems with the advent of the intersection of AI and the big data being used by various organizations. So that is going to also pose in a lot of different scenarios, and that's going to be threatening not just to individuals, but it's also going to be impacting the state actors as well. So that is one more area that I feel that needs to be addressed. So this is one more area, because it's a huge dragnet, shall I say, because given the fact that there is no specific AI and the big data legislation so far, interpreting them in terms of the present legal scenario, and then encapsulating that they are also data intermediaries. I think by and large, when you look at it, we're complying to the present legislation in breach rather than practice. So I think the compliance should be conditional, unconditional, and should not be conditional. So this is the way I think the present situation needs to be addressed. So long as big data analytics is now being used for a variety of purposes, and by a variety of players, whether it be state or non-state actors. I think till such time new technology is trying to replace it, I think more focus has to be laid down on laying certain kinds of roles and responsibilities that these organizations have to actually perform in terms of protecting the data, so as to ensure that proper due diligence has been adopted in protecting the privacy, protecting the data, as also ensuring that some kinds of basic protection mechanisms have been adopted in both these kinds of AI and then big data intersection. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
So AI and cybersecurity is a completely different ball game altogether, because what I would just like to tell you is two viewpoints here. The first viewpoint is that yes, AI is now being increasingly used for cybersecurity, and then it's a kind of mechanism which can add some kind of strength to cybersecurity mechanisms. Not just that, however, the same AI is now also being used in a different manner altogether to actually commence cybersecurity breaches. So it's a way that we're looking at it altogether. So shall I say that when I try to analyze both these scenarios, it's just like the wonderful quotation that I've seen on the Mumbai Cyber Police Cell website. I mean, that's a very wonderful quotation that I thought of just sharing with all of you. They've put up this quotation saying, if it's the technology that the cyber criminals make use of for committing the crimes, but it is the same technology that we as cyber police use to track them down. I think this is a very beautiful positive connotation by the Mumbai Cyber Police. I think this brings in a lot of inspiration, because unlike the fact that the cyber criminals are always in the cloak of anonymity, I think this is a completely different paradigm altogether, though not 100% practical. But I think it instills a lot of different positive approach and connotation as far as the conviction of cyber criminals is concerned. So why I spoke of that is, in the same manner, cybersecurity and AI used in a positive way can be enormous, used in the negative way can be disastrous. So just thought of sharing these two perspectives with you. Not just that, I think cybersecurity law is the new law in the horizon. Why? Because there's a specific need to come up with distinctive cybersecurity law. I think even there's been an international commission constituted, and then on cybersecurity law. And not just that, a lot of countries are now coming up and recognizing the fact that there is a requirement to have a dedicated cybersecurity legislation in place, so as to ensure that the proper kinds of due diligence and the specific cybersecurity compliance obligations have been laid down on various state or non-state actors. That being so, I think AI in terms of cybersecurity is going to be playing a very, very distinctive role as we go forward, because already we started to see that a lot of companies have now been leveraging the advantages that artificial intelligence has to bring in a lot of cybersecurity aspects as well. So they're trying to elaborate the principles of the intersection of AI and cybersecurity in a manner which is you going to be used in a positive manner. But however, it's going to be very, very important that a proper standard and proper principles are defined in the line of artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, legal compliance, because but the responsibility is just not on the stakeholders who are actually making use of AI, but also on the people who are trying to feed in the data would also have to be brought into this ambit of cybersecurity law as well. So I think it's not just that, but some amount of care, due diligence, standards of norms and behavior in the terms of defining what kinds of roles and responsibilities that have to be done in terms of protecting cybersecurity, the specific kinds of cybersecurity compliance obligations would also be assuming a greater significance. And just not that, I think already some countries have come up with something called cyber security policy. Even India has come up with a national cyber security policy in 2013. I think this also needs to be revisited in terms of providing some kinds of light on the AI cyber security, so that some kinds of development can happen to a particular area of jurisprudence. Not just that, doing a cybersecurity audit on AI systems is also going to assume a great significance as we go forward. Why? Because given the fact that doing it on a normal system is is also likely to impact some kinds of data privacy and data protection and the like. But performing cybersecurity audit on AI systems is going to be very, very different challenge altogether. More so when there's no human intervention altogether on the AI systems. So I think the this is also an aspect that the artificial intelligence lawmakers would have to keep in mind while coming up with distinctive jurisprudence and jurisprudential aspects relating to the intersection of AI and cybersecurity. So this is one scenario, and not just that. One more kind of a scenario that I was actually wanting to talk of in this area is that, let's say that okay, the artificial intelligence is now bringing in a lot of advantages to various applications and fields. Okay, now the situation is okay. Let's take a hypothetical example so that I'm able to put this in a nutshell. Um, it may be possible that artificial intelligence may be asked to find out some kinds of remedies. Let's say, let's talk about the present population issue. If the artificial intelligence system has been asked to find out a remedy for controlling the population, I think one of the remedies that could be possibly coming out is randomly start killing people. Would be one of the solutions that any that in case AI system puts forth. I think this is going to be completely unpalatable, because talking from a humanity and human rights perspective, this is also going to bring in a different kinds of paradigm altogether. Not just that, in case the cyber security can be compromised with the intersection of AI into them, that's also going to be completely a different paradigm altogether. Because when artificial intelligence has been by and large used by a lot of cyber criminals to breach cyber security of various entities and the like, it's going to be different altogether, because the kind of penetration of AI into cybersecurity would also be defined specifically so as to ensure that things are going in the right direction. Next slide, please. So AI in cybercrime are also it's no longer the matter in the horizon, but it's also started to evolve. And more specifically, now with darknet coming in, AI and cybercrime are going to be increasingly assuming a greater paradigm as we go forward. It's not just that any kinds of cybercrime that is committed using artificial intelligence would bring in civil and criminal liability, and the message of deterrence has to be the new mantra, because unless this message of deterrence is gone, I think it won't help in curbing cybercrimes. Not just that, with more and more artificial intelligence systems being taking intelligent decisions, there's a likelihood that in case this is compromised on the same, AI systems can actually self-commit cybercrimes. So that's going to be a completely different paradigm. And in that kind of scenario, attribution nexus is also going to be a very important aspect that we need to look into. Next slide, please. So not just that, AI and IP is also going to be one of the distinctive challenges, because ultimately AI is going to make use of huge amounts of data sets, and these data sets would be the intellectual property rights of many people. So whether it be personal, professional, or whether it's the company's perspective, I think AI is going to bring in a distinctive IP related challenges from copyright, patent, and trademarks perspective. And it's very important that the kind of innovations that are happening in AI. Can these AI output be considered as an invention as far as the patent law is concerned? Is also one such area that is receiving center stage attention. And not just that, adjudicating IP infringement scenario with regard to AI is also going to hold an important and significant place, because can the AI system be liable for IP infringement is going to be a very interesting question. Next slide, please. So morality is also going to be holding a completely different paradigm altogether. More specifically, that we don't have a universal moral standards, though we have something called Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, the morality standards differ from one jurisdiction to other. What may be fundamentally right in one may not be fundamentally right in the other. So therefore, when AI exceeds the human intelligence, there are going to be a lot of moral issues that are going to as we go forward. Um, Not just that, since AI and human beings are totally different entities altogether, can we ensure that the norms of moral code which is applied to human beings be applied on the machines as well? So this is another interesting scenario that we need to look at. Next slide, please. Now, ethical challenges are also going to be plenty. Why? Because can an AI system itself be ethical in case it's used for an unethical aspect? Not just that, specific ethical duty of care and norms of ethical behavior would have to be quantified in terms of artificial intelligence. Now, the situation is that if artificial intelligence is used for rendering a professional advice, let's say we as lawyers make use of artificial intelligence systems for generating a professional advice, would that be legal? What is the kind of legal status to such opinions generated thereof? Would the Bar Council recognize such kinds of professional advice? Is a very interesting debate that we need to look at. Not just that, the ethical standards are different in different jurisdictions. So I think that also is one area that we need to look at. Can AI systems also get themselves amenable to law for ethical issues? Is also one distinctive challenge that we need to go think as we go forward. Next slide, please. So this is one interesting picture that will be showcasing the kind of issues that I was talking about. So I think this says it all. Next slide, please. So AI is also likely to bring in a lot of taxation related challenges. Why? We are now beginning to slowly see that a lot of artificial intelligence based accounting systems are now being used for a variety of purposes. Now let's say that a wrong kind of calculation was done by this artificial intelligence system. Instead of debiting, it's made a credit. Instead of showing it as an expenditure, it's shown as an income. So what kinds of effect that is going to have is going to be completely a destabilizing effect, shall I say? So I think specific norms of behavior would also have to be addressed in this area. And with driverless car being the new reality, I think it's a very interesting scenario to apply the legal landscape to traffic violations done by these smart artificial intelligence driverless cars. That's also one more area that needs to be looked into, and more so that when a lot of municipalities and corporations across the nation and the world are now trying to make use of artificial intelligence tools for a variety of purposes, this might also inadvertently increase or decrease the revenue, which may be a very problematic scenario as far as this is concerned. And now there are lots of AI tools which are being used in the areas of taxation for doing a predictive analysis, for clustering and classifying. I think these are also going to be, these also require new distinctive legal approaches to be handled so as to ensure that the harmonized approach of law of taxation and law of artificial intelligence are being made so as to ensure there is no overlapping of both of these as you go forward. Next slide, please. Certifications and AI are also likely to bring in a lot of different kinds of scenarios, because what kinds of common standard certifications would be required by AI systems is going to be an important aspect. More so when there are a lot of data that is going to be fed into AI systems. Should the AI systems be compliant to ISO 27001, or is there a need to come up with new standards and certifications for AI systems is going to be the new toast of the times, shall I say. So that is also going to be one more aspect, and more so with AI being used for numerous professional activities, whether it's health, finance, banking, insurance, and legal. It's going to be completely a different paradigm altogether. Next slide, please. So AI and legal liabilities are going to be completely different. Who, in case of a breach or any issue committed by an AI system, who's liable? Is it the owner? Is it the manufacturer? Or is it the person using it? Or is it the respective person who has coded it? I think these are going to be the specific legal challenges that needs to be addressed with regard to affecting the liabilities for artificial intelligence systems as we go forward. Next slide, please. So, presently looking at the scenarios, I think AI legal remedies also need to be effectively amended so as to ensure that adequate amount of remedies are given to a person affected by an AI breach. Not just that, specific things have to be devised in this area. And one of the ways that you can do is switch off the system, remove certain data sets that are likely to be causing potential ramifications, and then also direct the system to be directing the system to be in a proper order while it's in operation. I think these are some things that I suggest which need to be specifically addressed as we go forward. I would say that we shouldn't take things on the face value. I think intelligent decisions have to be made so as to ensure whether things are proper or not. I'm just concluding in a minute. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk of three case studies quickly. This was one of the landmark judgments given by the United States that robots cannot be sued, and it's the manufacturer's civil liability for a defective AI system. This is one school of thought that says that yes, it's the manufacturer who would be facing a liability in case of a defective AI system. Next slide, please. This is one more case that I thought of highlighting, that the court in the New York has held that the manufacturer is not liable, but when a robotic gantry loading system has caused some kind of injury to a worker, the court observed that the manufacturer has complied with all the regulations, but it is something that happened beyond control. So this is one more school of thought that is trying to immune the liability of the manufacturer in case they have done their due diligence. And this can be specifically relatable under Section 79 of the Information Technology Act, which exempts liability to data intermediaries in case they have complied and have done their due diligence, and something more has happened beyond the control. Next slide, please. This is one more area that I thought of sharing with you, Nelson versus American Airlines. In this kind of a scenario, it was an autopilot that was used by these airlines. And as a result, an accident which was causing injury has taken place. And the onus was on the airlines to prove that they have exercised due diligence. And it was something that is not, that was unpreventable. And then it's something that was not avoidable that has triggered the accident. So that was the typical scenario that was actually being asked by the American Airlines. There's also, analyzing this from the present IPC, I think there's also a particular provision in the Indian Penal Code which says that something, if a harm is caused to you, in order to prevent further harm, I think you'll be exempt from that kind of liability. So I think this is also one guiding factor, shall I say, in determining liability of of AI providers and AI systems. Next slide, please. So this is the first slide that I actually started with. So all I wish to conclude is and tell you is that yes, there are lots of distinctive legal challenges brought in by AI and AI technology. But shall I say, interpreting that in the present scenario can be a step forward, but shall I say, are not adequately enough. So in my opinion, there needs to be a thought leadership on AI as law as a separate legal jurisprudence, and a lot of work needs to be happening in regard to AI. And at this moment, when I'm talking to you, if I were to write a book on AI and law, and if the book was supposed to consist of 100 pages, and I think I'm trying to tell you that we're only written 5 or 6 pages, and there's a lot of pages that need to be written as we go forward. And using artificial intelligence now without adequate legal protection is going to be a historical mistake, and it's going to also turn out to be a toothless wonder as we go forward. Next slide, please. So what is necessary is only what is required. So given the time of 45 minutes, I think I just tried to bring in certain kinds of areas that I thought are going to be essential as we go forward. Um, so thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. I think this kind of a presentation and discussion would add key colors to the legal landscape of AI jurisprudence, and let's ensure that we are staying safe, preventing ourselves from any kinds of COVID-related issues. And once again, thank Abhivardhan, as also Baldeep, as also the Indian Society of Artificial Intelligence and Law for giving me this wonderful opportunity. It's a pleasure talking to you this evening. Thank you.